Granddaughter's roller skates were sitting on the front porch when I pulled up that Sunday afternoon, pink ones with little white wheels. She'd left them out again, which meant she'd been there recently, which meant my son was probably still at the house. I remember thinking that. I remember noticing the skates before I noticed anything else. I should have known something was wrong the moment I knocked, and my daughter-in-law answered instead of my son. She looked at me the way she always did. That particular kind of polite that isn't polite at all, the smile that stops before it reaches the eyes, the slight pause before she says anything, like she's calculating whether I'm worth the energy. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse, hair done up nice, and she stepped aside just barely enough to let me through the door. "He's in the kitchen," she said, already walking back toward the living room. I found my son Lyle sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He's 41 years old, built like I was at his age, broad shoulders, good hands. But that afternoon he was hunched over that mug, like something had taken the air out of him. "Dad," he said, "what happened?" He shook his head. "Not a nothing happened shake. I don't know where to start shake." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I've known my son for every minute of his life. I know the difference between his moods the way you know the difference between weather systems. The pressure in the air changes before the storm shows up. That afternoon the pressure was very low. "Lyle, talk to me." He set the mud down. "Brentwood's been on me again." Brentwood. That was what he called his father-in-law. Never my father-in-law. Never Cecilia's dad. Just Brentwood, like the name itself was already a problem. Brentwood Okafor had money. That was the first thing you needed to understand about him. Not old money, new money, the kind that comes fast and makes a man loud. He'd built a logistics company in Atlanta over 15 years, sold off pieces of it at the right time, and now he lived in a house in Buckhead that had more square footage than my entire neighborhood growing up. He was 63 years old, wore watches that cost more than most people's cars, and had decided within 6 months of his daughter marrying my son that Lyle was not good enough. Lyle was a high school history teacher. He coached JV football on the side. He made decent money, not spectacular money, and he loved what he did. You could see it in him when he talked about his students, which he did often. He was a good man, a patient man, but Brentwood had no use for good and patient. Brentwood had use for profitable. "He showed up here?" I asked. Lyle nodded slowly. "Yesterday, with Cecilia. They came to pick up Maya for the weekend." He paused. "He said in front of Cecilia, in front of Maya, that a man who can't afford to take his family on vacation in the summer isn't a real provider." I kept my face still. "He said it just like that," Lyle continued. "Casual, like he was commenting on the weather. And Maya was right there, Dad. She's 8. She was standing right there holding her backpack, and he said it like she wasn't even in the room. My granddaughter, 8 years old, holding her little backpack, listening to her grandfather tell her father he wasn't a real man." I asked Lyle what Cecilia did. He looked down at the table. She laughed a little, said her dad was just joking around. That was the moment I understood how deep this had gone. It wasn't just Brentwood. Cecilia had grown up watching her father treat people as either useful or beneath him, and somewhere along the way that had become her normal. She wasn't a cruel woman. I want to be fair about that. But she had learned to laugh at her father's cruelty, the way you learn to walk around furniture in the dark. You stop noticing the bruises. I stayed for another hour. I made us both sandwiches, which is what I do when I don't know what else to do. We talked, or we sat in silence that felt like talking. Before I left, I hugged my son and told him things would get better. I drove home with my hands very steady on the wheel. I should tell you something about myself because it matters to what happened next. I'm 67 years old. I retired 3 years ago from a career I never made a big deal about at family dinners or neighborhood cookouts. I'm a quiet man by nature. I grew up watching my father, who worked in a textile mill in Greensboro, North Carolina, raise 4 kids on shift wages with a dignity that never required announcement. He never told anyone how hard things were. He just handled them. I think I absorbed that. I think it became so deep in me that I sometimes forgot other people didn't know it was there. My son didn't know what I had done for 38 years. That wasn't entirely my fault or entirely intentional. When Lyle was young, I told him I worked for the state. That was true. When he got older and stopped asking, I stopped explaining. It became a non-topic. His mother, God rest her, knew everything, but she'd been gone 14 years, and she took our private life with her the way she took everything, quietly and completely. What I'd been, for 38 years, was a federal criminal prosecutor. I retired as the chief of the public corruption unit for the Northern District of Georgia. I had tried 61 cases in federal court. I had a conviction rate that my colleagues in other districts occasionally mentioned at conferences in tones that embarrassed me. I knew every judge in the Northern District by first name. I knew attorneys on both sides of the aisle, the good ones and the ones you had to watch. I knew how the system worked because I had spent 4 decades being one of the load-bearing walls of it. I had never told Brentwood or Carfer any of this, because Brentwood or Carfer had never asked me anything about myself. In 4 years of Sunday dinners and holiday tables and Maya's birthday parties, he had never once asked me what I did. I was Lyle's father. That was all I was to him. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, I made a phone call. His name was Terence. I won't give his last name here, but Terence and I had worked together for 11 years before he moved to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI's Atlanta field office. He was 54, meticulous, and he owed me a favor that he knew I had never called in. "I need you to pull something up for me," I said when he answered, informally. There was a pause. "How informal?" "Background only. Just tell me if there's anything worth looking at." He asked me the name. I gave him Brentwood Okafor and the name of his company, and I told him to take his time. He called me back in 2 days. "You sure you want to go down this road?" he said when I answered. I told him I was sure. What Terence told me, and I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying here, because I am still a careful man, was that there were irregularities in how Brentwood had structured the sale of certain divisions of his company. There were payments to LLCs that appeared to be shell entities. There were tax filings that contained what Terence delicately called creative interpretations of depreciation schedules. None of it had been investigated. None of it had crossed anyone's desk in a formal capacity. But it was there, patient and undisturbed, the way things in the dark are patient. "This is the kind of thing," Terence said, "that someone would want to get ahead of." I thanked him. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I want to be clear about something. I am not the kind of man who uses what I know as a weapon. I spent 38 years in service to due process, and I believe in it with every part of me. What I was thinking about was not a threat, not leverage, not anything that crossed a legal or ethical line. What I was thinking about was a conversation, an honest one, between 2 men who understood what certain information meant. I called Brentwood Okafor's office the next morning. His assistant, a young woman who was very professionally brisk, told me Mr. Okafor's calendar was full for the next 2 weeks. I said I understood, and I gave her my name and I gave her my former title, Chief, Public Corruption Unit, U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern District of Georgia. And I said I simply wanted to have a private lunch with him at his earliest convenience. She put me on hold. She came back in 40 seconds and told me Mr. Okafor had an opening Thursday at noon. I wore a plain grey suit. I drove myself. The restaurant he chose was downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list that arrives in its own leather jacket. He was already there when I arrived, which surprised me. Brentwood Okafor was a man who liked making people wait. He stood when I approached the table. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe I'd never looked at him straight on before. "Mr. Webb," he said, shaking my hand. "Not Lyle's dad, Mr. Webb." The title had done something. We sat. We ordered water. The server appeared and then disappeared tactfully. For the first 60 seconds, neither of us spoke about what we were there to speak about. He asked how I was enjoying retirement. I asked about his golf game. It was the surface conversation of two men waiting to see who would drop below it first. I dropped first. "Brentwood," I said, and I used his first name deliberately. "I want to talk about my son." Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet. More like recalibration. "Lyle's a good man," I said. "He is patient and he is kind, and he loves your daughter and my granddaughter in ways that are real and lasting and not contingent on income brackets. I think you know that on some level. I think you know exactly what kind of man he is." Brentwood set down his water glass. With respect. "I'm not finished," I said, not unkindly, but clearly. He stopped. "The comment you made in front of Maya last Sunday about real providers. You said that to an 8-year-old child about her father. I let that sit for a moment. I'm asking you to understand the weight of what you did there, not as Lyle's father, as a grandfather who has watched that little girl since the day she was born." Brentwood leaned back slightly. His jaw had gone to that particular kind of hard that men get when they're deciding between apology and aggression. He chose a version of aggression that wears expensive suits. "I built something from nothing," he said. "I know what it takes to provide for a family and what it takes to build security for the people you love. Lyle is a fine person, but teaching history to teenagers is not building security. That's the reality. I want more for my daughter. I want more for Maya. That is not an apology-worthy position." I looked at him for a moment. "Do you know what I did?" I said, "for the 38 years before I retired?" He didn't answer. "I prosecuted public corruption for the federal government. I was, for the last 12 years, the chief of that unit in this district." I paused. "In the course of my retirement activities, because men like me don't fully stop, it's just the nature of the work, I've had some interesting conversations recently about the structure of your company's 2019 asset sale, specifically the payments to LLCs registered in Delaware, and the depreciation filings on the equipment held in the Alabama subsidiary." The color didn't drain from his face all at once. It went incrementally, like a slow leak. "I want to be absolutely clear," I continued, and I kept my voice at the temperature of a reasonable man having a reasonable lunch, "that I have not initiated anything formal. I have not filed anything, referred anything, or spoken to anyone in an official capacity. This is a private conversation. It will remain a private conversation as long as the situation between you and my son remains private." "Are you threatening me?" he said, very quietly. "I'm explaining a situation," I said. "There's a meaningful difference. I spent 38 years articulating that difference in federal court." He sat very still. I took a sip of my water. "What I am asking for is simple. Stop. Stop the comments at dinner. Stop the comparisons. Stop using my granddaughter as an audience for your disappointment in my son. Go home and be present with your daughter and her husband, and let them build their life without your editorial commentary on its shortcomings." I set the glass down. "That's the whole ask. It's not complicated." Brentwood Okafor did not say anything for a very long time. Then he said very quietly, "You came a long way to make that point." "My son," I said, "doesn't know I'm here, and I would prefer he never does. This stays between us." He nodded once, slowly. We ordered lunch. We ate it with a kind of armed civility that was somehow easier than anything we'd shared before. He asked me questions about the cases I'd tried. I answered some of them. He was, underneath everything, an intelligent man. And intelligent men understand when the structure of a situation has shifted. We parted on the sidewalk. He shook my hand again. "Your son is a lucky man," he said. "He earned it," I said. I drove home. The change was not immediate. I wouldn't tell you that because it wouldn't be true, and I'm not interested in the version of this story that's too clean to be real. There were still dinners where I could see Brentwood measuring things in his eyes. There was still a stiffness between him and Lyle that would take years to fully work itself out, if it ever did. But the comments stopped. At Maya's 9th birthday party, a backyard thing, paper streamers, way too much cake, I watched Brentwood sit across the picnic table from Lyle and listen, while Lyle talked about one of his students, a kid from a tough home who'd written an essay about Frederick Douglass that Lyle said was the best thing he'd read all year. Brentwood asked questions, not gracious questions, not performance questions, but real ones. What was the kid's name? What happened to him? Did Lyle think he'd go to college? It wasn't a friendship. It may never be, but it was the absence of cruelty, and in that family, in that moment, the absence of cruelty was everything. Maya blew out her candles, and whatever she wished for, she kept to herself. My son hugged me at the end of the evening, by the cars, under the maple tree in the front yard. He said, "Dad, I don't know what changed with him, but something did. He's been different." I said, "People surprise you." He laughed a little. "Yeah, I guess they do." He pulled back and looked at me the way sons look at their fathers when they're trying to read something that isn't written anywhere visible. "You doing okay?" he said. "I'm doing fine," I said. I drove home in the October dark, with the windows cracked and the radio off. My hands were steady on the wheel, the way they've always been, the way they taught me to keep them a long time ago, when the stakes were higher than any of us wanted to admit. I am 67 years old, and I'm tired, and I'm proud of my son in ways I have never found the right words for. Some things you carry quietly your whole life, and some things, when it matters, you set down just long enough to change everything. I still think about that Sunday afternoon sometimes. The pink roller skates on the porch. My son sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink. There was something so specific about that image. A grown man, a good man, quietly hollowed out by words that should never have been said in the first place. People like Brentwood move through the world with a particular kind of confidence. They've confused the accumulation of money with the accumulation of worth, and over enough years that confusion calcifies into something that feels, to them, like wisdom. They don't think of themselves as cruel. They think of themselves as honest. They believe they are simply telling hard truths that softer people can't stomach. What they don't account for is the cost of those truths, who pays it, and how long they carry it. Lyle paid it every Sunday dinner for 4 years. Maya paid it the afternoon her grandfather reduced her father to a punchline while she stood there holding her backpack. That's the part I keep coming back to, not what Brentwood said to my son, but what my granddaughter heard. Children don't file things away and forget them. They file things away and build on top of them. What you say about a father in front of his child becomes part of how that child understands the world. What strength looks like, what respect looks like, what family is supposed to feel like. I was not going to let Maya build her foundation on that. I've been called a quiet man my whole life, and I think that's accurate. But quiet isn't the same as passive. There's a difference between not announcing yourself and not being prepared. I spent 38 years in rooms where the careful, methodical thing was always more powerful than the loud thing. I learned that the hard way, watching cases crumble because someone let their emotion outrun their evidence. You don't win by being the angriest person in the room. You win by being the most prepared. That's what I want Lyle to understand, and what I hope Maya will understand someday, when she's old enough to hear any version of this story. Integrity isn't a feeling, it's a practice. It's the thing you do when nobody's watching, year after year, that determines what you're actually capable of when it matters. Lyle taught history to teenagers because he believed in something. He showed up every day not for the salary, but because he understood that the work was real. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is, the kind that doesn't require applause. And resilience, the ability to absorb what someone throws at you and not become it. That's not something you're born with. It's something you'll build in the quiet years. Lyle built it. I watched him. He never became bitter, never became cold, never stopped being patient with his daughter or kind to his students or present at the dinner table, even when the dinner was uncomfortable. He kept going. That matters. Brentwood eventually asked me as we were parting ways on that sidewalk whether I had spent my whole career being this measured. I told him I'd had a lot of practice. What I didn't tell him was that some of that practice came from raising a son I was very proud of, even when he didn't know I was watching, and even when I didn't tell him so nearly enough. I'm telling him now, I suppose. In my own quiet way. That's always been how I do things.